This is Scott Loveridge. I'm with the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development, and I'll be your moderator today. Our presenter is Wes Eaton. Wes has a PhD from sociology in the department here on campus at Michigan State University. And he's been spending some time this summer with us as a postdoctoral consultant. He will be moving on to a position at Penn State University in the fall, so he's staying in the land-grant fold. And we're really looking forward to finding out more about what he's been thinking about this summer. So I'll turn it over to you, Wes.
Again, my name is Wes Eaton. Thanks for participating today. The title of my webinar and project at NCR-CRD is a roadmap for improving public engagement around complex, emergent, and contested science and technology issues. So perhaps the best way to start is to clarify what this project and webinar is not about. First, I'm not going to be discussing social media technologies like Twitter or Facebook, despite the use of the word technology in the title. While these are important, these are not necessarily the kind of technologies I'm interested in here. Second, I'm not going to make an argument about any new engagement activity or facilitation technique. There are rich resources already on effective facilitation techniques, and you are aware or have experience with these. Instead, what will I be doing? I'm going to be drawing attention to ways emergent and contested science and technology issues create challenges for public engagement, achieving successful engagement. And I want to offer what I'm calling a roadmap or a resource for navigating these challenges during early planning phases of engagement around emerging technologies. I also wanted to point out that rather than any kind of a specific training, my aim here in this webinar is to share this roadmap and walk through the 6 sections of the roadmap, and in particular gather feedback or inspire folks to talk with me more about this or maybe give it a try. So I'm going to be asking you now and again at the end if you'd be willing to look over this roadmap after I introduce it today, and again at a later date provide comments. We can start doing that with some of the comment features we'll be pulling up at the end of the webinar. And I also wanted to point out that you can use the chat feature at any time to raise questions, and I'll be getting a copy of this whether or not I can respond to it at the immediate time. Okay, so let me give an overview. First and foremost, I want to point out that this is going to be a concise presentation. I'm not going to be keeping you here for your entire afternoon. Specifically, I'm going to start by giving some definitions, some working definitions myself and my advisory group from this project have been working on to get a collective understanding of what successful engagement means, and also for emerging technologies, what I mean by that phrase and term. I'm going to give some background as to how this research project this summer has unfolded, things I've done. Then I'm going to introduce how myself and the advisory board and others are envisioning how we might use this roadmap. Then what we're going to do is move from the PowerPoint to an actual PDF file that we'll all be looking at together of the roadmap. And what I'm just going to do there, and I'll highlight it now, is while I'm going to put the roadmap up, I'm just going to briefly discuss each section of the roadmap and how we see it as being useful. And then after that, we can ask some questions, and I'll wrap things up. So let's start with some of those definitions I was talking about. The first definition is, and why I'm giving these, it's important to keep in mind that we have this shared understanding of what successful engagement is, and in particular around emerging technology. So I'm just going to take a minute to clarify these. So a lot of words on the screen, but essentially successful engagement brings together diverse individuals and groups with various interests for the purpose of visioning, decision-making, and planning, intended to foster meaningful and equitable exchange of ideas, serving the common good in a just and ethical manner without doing harm to others or the environment. Quite a high standard there, and that's what we're striving for. However, Engagement around emerging technology issues is frequently plagued by uncertainty. This forces Extension and their partners to engage with scientific and other forms of knowledge that may be incomplete or contested, or with assumptions that may not be accurate. So what do I mean by that? That leads us to this definition of emerging technologies. So there's several parts to this definition. I'm going to walk us through them and then give some examples of each of them. First and foremost, emerging technologies are those in a development stage where expert and public knowledge is uncertain, ill-defined, or in its infancy. Due to this emergent state, the benefits of emerging technologies may be vague, in flux, or contested, as I'm sure many of you folks are familiar with. I'll get to some examples here in a second, but specifically, one facet of emerging technologies is actually new technologies, where the science and knowledge and understanding of these technologies is partial or incomplete, or where expert or public understandings of scientific innovation and their impacts is not yet fully formed. So you can see the stress here, the emphasis on the process. This is an ongoing scientific process. So these examples might be drones, precision agriculture, renewable energy technologies, or genetically modified organisms. Some of them. Some, of course, have been around for a while. But some of these technologies, as you can see, are literally very new. Now, at the same time, emerging technologies are not necessarily new for everyone. Instead, emerging technologies may be, as I'm saying, old hat for some, but new for others. Some examples here are biofuels, fracking. And these examples, I should stress, are coming from some interviews I've done with Extension folks, and then I'll talk about that more in a minute. Or fracking contamination detection, water contamination detection devices. These are all good examples of where older technologies find new uses. Moreover, emerging technologies include not only things, not only artifacts, instruments, devices, or software, but processes as well. So the example I have here is using existing data to construct new scientific models for understanding climate change impacts, or using existing collected data in new ways to understand, let's say, soil erosion processes. These are emerging technologies as well. So the point is, what all emerging technologies share is a degree of uncertainty about what benefit or risk the device, artifact, or process might provide to society. Importantly, engagement, public engagement, what we're talking about here, around emerging technologies unfolds within this context of uncertainty. So let me give a little brief background on this particular research project. My interest in this first grew with work I did as a graduate student on woody-biomass energy development in Michigan, where I partnered with Extension and Extension specialists to do an engaged facilitation using the Kettering Foundation programming to do some common groundwork. And one thing that stuck out to me in the communities we visited and conducted interviews with is, while these technologies were very familiar to the specialists and experts we were working with, they were quite new to folks in these communities. So this is what first brought my intrigue into how the newness of technologies provides a distinct set of challenges for public engagement, university engagement with publics and citizens. So that leads me to, again, let me just want to underscore the premise here. Emerging technologies provide challenges, and what is needed is a practical resource for addressing these challenges. That's the premise I'm operating under here. So the research methods for this particular project, first thing I did was organized a 4-person advisory board of Extension professionals who have experience working with emerging technologies. They helped me identify several other Extension professionals across the region for this group that were interested in discussing their work around emerging technologies. And I spent anywhere from a half hour to a couple hours on the phone working with emerging technologies with an eye out for pitfalls or challenges, or for how they tackled and tangled with this, the challenges that we're talking about here about uncertain science. At the same time, I've been conducting a literature review. This comes from social science on science and technology studies, and also the social science on the public understanding of science. And together with this more recent research, as well as a literature review, I developed the draft roadmap that we're going to walk through today. Okay, let me take a minute to introduce the roadmap before we actually, well, actually, not quite yet, Rosa. I've got a few more slides. Thank you. So, what is the roadmap? What are we going to be looking at, and how are we thinking of using it? First of all, the roadmap I'm envisioning as a planning resource, which is intended to help public engagement organizers plan for successful engagement around emerging technologies. Okay, this resource is to be used with your engagement planning team, which I like to call an EPT, during the early planning phases of engagement. This is how we're envisioning it being used. How does it work? Okay, the roadmap we're going to be looking at here in a moment is made up of 6 sections, and each of these sections is organized around key aspects of understanding the complexities of emerging technologies. In each section, there's going to be a series of prompts that more clearly articulate the substance of these complexities and ask readers to interact with the roadmap by responding to the prompts. Specifically, the prompts ask your EPT or planning team to anticipate the key challenges for emerging technologies. That's the real key here. This is a resource that's devised to help folks anticipate what the literature and what research is showing us are the pitfalls and challenges of engagement around these sorts of topics and issues. And your responses to these prompts are intended to stimulate thinking, reflection, and proactive planning for better engagement. And I think now, Rosa, if you would throw the assessment or the roadmap on the screen. So this is a PDF of the actual document that I'm hoping folks will take with them and provide feedback on. So there's a lot of text on the screen, as you can see. It's not up there for you folks to, I don't expect folks to be reading this in the next 5 minutes. But again, just like emerging technologies can be difficult to interact with if they're distant and you can't experience them, I wanted us all to experience this document together. So the first page, as you can see, has some of these same definitions we just worked through. So I'm going to walk us through each of these 6 themes very briefly. The 6 themes have 2 parts. First, there's a descriptive part that you're looking at here, and then after each descriptive part, there are the actual prompts. So let me just say a few words about each of the themes, and then we can open up for some questions. So the first theme here is simply, are we engaging around an emerging technology in the first place? How do we know if we're engaging around an emerging technology? So, again, is the issue at hand a new technology? Is it a new process for converting biomass into energy, for instance? Is it a new application of an existing technology, or a new process for managing issues? A new process for using data on climate change, for instance? So, the first step is identifying whether it is with the prompts. And here's the prompts on the second page. And if so, what we're recommending is that what the roadmap suggests is that if indeed the technology you're engaging around does qualify as an emerging technology, even if this is something your team may have more or less familiarity with, then what the roadmap suggests is that you identify individuals with relevant expertise from a range of sectors. So industry, academia, civil society. The point here is diverse experts. diverse people who have knowledge on this. And you ask them to provide information about the emerging technology. To avoid reproducing biases, you want to ask each of these folks the same questions, which is to explain their understanding of the issue technology, their understanding of its origins, their understanding of its benefits, and their understanding of its risks. So the themes 1 and 2 are quite general, and we get a little bit more specific as we move down. Theme 2 is something I'm sure you're all extremely and intimately familiar with. This is value conflicts. Value conflicts are the hallmark of a term I'm sure folks here are familiar with, wicked problems. So just to put some definitions out there, values are beliefs about what society ought to look like. Again, I don't expect folks to be reading this word for word. Value conflicts are disagreements over what values ought to be prioritized at the expense of others. These conflicts can divide engagement participants and provide challenges for decision making. In particular, emerging technologies are prone to value conflicts as their future benefits, use value, or risks are often unknown in the present. So, for example, consider emerging value conflicts over, say, large wind energy development. So, on the one hand, groups may be prioritizing the value of renewable energy development or economic benefits, while for others, the risk of adverse impacts, let's say, on wildlife or landscape aesthetics ought to be prioritized. Okay, the point here is that extension can begin to incorporate the presence of value conflicts before public engagement begins, and that doing so might help managing these tensions. So let's take a look at the prompts. The prompts here essentially are asking your planning team to anticipate what values might be most important for all groups participating in the engagement. Okay, so this includes identifying values for the planning team itself. You can see how we have this list here envisioned for folks to keep track of these. Again, the point here is anticipating these things. Much of this roadmap requires folks to engage and operate with these ideas in a state of uncertainty because, of course, many of these things are not known entirely. So we're looking for tendencies and anticipated possibilities. Okay, so some of the later prompts down below here, they ask the planning team to anticipate how relevant are these value conflicts for the engagement. And then there's no need to rewrite the facilitation book here. Folks are familiar with or can become familiar with the rich literature on deliberative dialogue or other facilitation techniques for uncovering common ground or common values. But the point here is to anticipate these things and incorporate them before you get rolling with your all the way through the engagement. So let's move on to the theme 3, which is a little more particular to emerging technologies, which is called emergent and contested science. The question we're keeping in mind here is whether emergent or contested science or other forms of knowledge complicate achieving successful engagement around this technology. So this section, I think most importantly, draws attention to how objective, evidence-based research, which is the gold standard for evaluating technologies, simply may not be readily available in cases of emerging technologies. So let me give some examples. A good way to think about this is keeping in mind the way that scientific research itself is an ongoing process, and couple this with new emergent technologies and you having an even faster pace. So these examples ask us to look back in time historically a little bit and look at how scientific findings continue to change over a short period of times. So some examples I wrote down here is considering the research around the risks and benefits of what's being called fracking, risk and benefits of various herbicides like atrazine, CAFOs, or some genetically modified foods, and corn biofuels is another contemporary, powerful example here. So in the past, it could be argued that the evidence-based research around these emerging technologies seemed to suggest these were safe and beneficial. Now, however, scientific research is raising new questions regarding human health and environmental impacts. At the same time, keep in mind that formal science is not always the only applicable form of knowledge. Local, historical, indigenous knowledge, or faith-based understandings can also be central to technology issues. Okay, the point then in this section is to recognize that objective science may not always be available. For instance, it may be ongoing. Research may not exist at the time. There may not be research on that area. And that scientific research may be contested by other research and other ways of knowing the world. So what do we do about this? How do we incorporate this into engagement is the question this section of the roadmap is trying to tackle here. So what the prompts are essentially asking us to do is anticipate, first and foremost, whether evidence-based research is important for the technology issue at hand, and if so, anticipate what science or knowledge is relevant for each participant group. You see how we have this here, including for the planning team, as well as for anticipating the emergent or unknown groups, something called maybe the empty chair method. Later prompts, you can see this section's a little bit longer than the earlier ones. I'm just going to speak to them briefly. Later prompts ask your planning team to anticipate whether the relevant science or knowledge is trusted, level of trust or credibility, that is, whether the science itself is new and emergent, and whether science is contested by others in the scientific community. You can see each of these come with an action. Okay, I'm going to move us on to section 4. This is about expectations for Extension's role regarding delivering expertise. And you can see the second line there. What roles will Extension and their partners expect of Extension regarding relevant knowledge and expertise for decision making? So here attention is drawn in the roadmap to the roles Extension and their partners expect Extension to play. Traditionally, Extension's role has been to connect stakeholders and citizens to relevant expertise and evidence-based research. But as the above sections that we just discussed point to, this becomes tricky when science and expertise is emergent, contested, or perhaps simply unavailable. So, what the prompts here ask is for the planning team to reflect on 4 idealized roles that others and Extension expect of Extension. And this is covered here in the second paragraph. Again, I don't expect folks to be reading this in its entirety right here. I'm just going to talk about it. These 4 roles, let's talk about these 4 roles. One role that Extension may be expected to play, we could call the peer scientist. Okay, maybe Extension is being expected to focus on the facts rather than providing opinions, personal or subjective views. So again, this is the expectation. A second role may be something called a science arbiter. Perhaps Extension is expected to respond only to questions posed of them rather than providing additional questions and answers. A third role is something called an issue advocate. So perhaps Extension is expected to reduce the scope of choice options and advocate for a particular approach. Lastly, Extension may be expected to act as something called an honest broker. This would be expanding the scope of options for expertise, as well as evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of different sources of expertise. So the prompts here ask the planning team to go through here, 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 and here to rank order what the engagement partners may be expecting of extension in the engagement, and then for the engagement planning team itself to rank what it expects it can do. Now, the later prompts in this section ask the planning team to reflect on the implications of playing these expected roles, perhaps the implications of these being expected roles, and also to anticipate hurdles for living up to what these roles entail. Okay, we have 2 more sections, and that will wrap up the roadmap. So this 5th theme is called Imagining, Defining, and Engaging with Publics and Stakeholders. Long title. The purpose of this section is to call attention to ways emerging technologies and science often entails emergent social groups. So the focus now is on the social groups emerging around issues rather than a new artifact, that is. So that is, emerging technologies are about future benefits, which requires us to actively envision, imagine, or anticipate how future groups of people will respond and be impacted. Okay, so we don't need to look hard for examples here. Let's take the case of the hot topic of fracking. Again, this technology is not new, especially in Michigan. However, public concerns over fracking are new and emergent and have catalyzed the formation of new groups of researchers, for instance, concerned citizens, policy groups, for example. Okay, so what this example points to is the ways the emergent status of social groups, let's say their concerns, their interests, their responses, and the implications of these concerns, interests, and responses for the future of the emerging technology, all of this remains unknown in the present. Okay, so of course it is not possible to know what the future might hold. But the point here in this section is that these unknowns can perhaps be managed in more or less effective ways. So the prompts in this section are intended to help the engagement planning team anticipate what emergent groups' concerns and interests might be, as well as actively imagine responses of as of yet unknown groups. You can see the prompts there with spaces for those. And let's do the final theme, theme 6, experience in emerging technologies. This was one of the themes that came up in at least half of the interviews I conducted with some of folks that are signed in here today and other extension professionals. So the focus here is kind of a paradox. On the one hand, there's a need for people to see the topic of engagement as important for their lives in order for engagement to be successful. This is also true for the engagement planning team. If this is not something that they see as important, engagement is going to suffer if never come to fruition. But at the same time, on the other hand, there are inherent difficulties in experiencing emerging technologies, either directly or indirectly. Emerging technologies can be intangible, vague, in flux, outside of our realm of direct experience. So a couple things that came to mind with interviews conducted for this project, as well as some earlier research, would be the case of nanotechnologies, maybe nanotechnologies used to monitor livestock. Another example may be technologies and research methods for measuring dioxins or other toxicants in the environment, or complex methods for testing beach water quality. There's new technology out there that's getting some press coverage. Or scientific models for estimating local impacts of climate change. So the wider public is likely unaware of many of these technologies. Moreover, these are technologies that most people cannot experience directly. It means they can't touch, see, taste, or smell them. Maybe can't be in the same room as them, can't drive by them. Nor do they attract sustained media coverage. Furthermore, these examples show how emerging technologies can be technically complex and require specialized training in order to develop a scientific understanding of their uses and implications. All this stresses the distance between the human experience and emerging technologies, and again, needing to bridge this gulf in order to come to successful engagement. So the prompts in this final section are intended to help your planning team anticipate what kind of experience groups you will be engaging with and partnering with, have with the emerging technology in the first place, and anticipate the relevance this technology might have for their personal lives. You can see that this may be more or less a hypothetical exercise depending on what phase your engagement activity is in or whether you've identified partners yet for this. Moreover, the prompts here, you can see here's the prompts that list the groups. They also guide the planning team itself in reflecting on their own experiences and their own ideas of whether it's relevant for their lives or relevant for whose lives, and anticipate experience emergent groups may have. That is, anticipating what groups may be emerging around these. Okay, so Rosa, you can pull back up the PowerPoint. So essentially, to summarize the roadmap, to put all that in one sentence, I would say that the roadmap is a resource meant to guide engagement planning teams through deliberate reflection on what research tells us are key challenges of achieving successful engagement around contested and emergent science and technologies in order to anticipate and better manage these challenges. No, I don't have that on a PowerPoint slide if folks were wondering. But again, it's a resource meant to guide engagement through deliberative reflection on what the research is telling us are the most important challenges of achieving this in order to anticipate and better manage these challenges. So, at this point, I'm going to take a breath and stop talking for just a second. And Rosa is going to pull out a few polls. It'd be great if I could get a little feedback on these polls. And most importantly, I'd really like to know if you'd be willing to take the roadmap, which is going to be available in a PDF file on the NCR-CRD website, and spend a little time with it, look it over, and think about how it might relate to your work. Again, this is a work in progress, and I hope this can be something that can be useful. And the more folks with experience that you have, I can see some folks over here listed as participants that can provide feedback. I think the more useful this could become. Also, maybe point out things that it's missing or point out problems, hopefully. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll thank Rosa and Scott and the advisory team on this research project, as well as folks who discussed and interviewed with me, discussed their own work, and for you participating today. I appreciate that.
Well, thanks very much, Wes, for that romp through the thinking that you've been doing about this issue over the last few weeks here. It's interesting to kind of summarize this in a very succinct fashion. I think it will be useful for folks across all the different program areas that extension professionals are working in. One question that I had for you is, in these interviews that you were doing, did you ever come across or have a thought that the person A said X and person B said negative X? So were the two perspectives that were being shared with you were not at all in sync with each other, and can you describe that if you did notice that?
Sure. I think even more salient was when person A would say X and then person A would later say Y, was also important. And I'm not saying that to point out that there was any being hypocritical or anything, as much as some of the standards or goals that we have for engagement are really high, and then putting them into action is extremely challenging. So a person spoke about the need to bring in publics earlier on in engagement process, and then later on discussed an engagement practice intentionally. They spoke about this because I asked them to talk about where they had a problem or where an emerging technology issue really showed a pitfall. They were invited to speak to a community about wind energy development. And this person has had expertise on some of the legal framework there. And this person had a challenging experience because it wasn't anticipated that this was such a hot and contested topic in the community that they went into. So I guess that's just to point out on the one hand, I don't think that anything I'm saying today is new. Of course not. What's going on here is this is bringing together a rather diverse set of literature on public understanding and engagement into something concise that may be more practical for an engagement planning team to hammer out at a first step in an afternoon meeting, as opposed to some of these goals or visions here would take a lifetime, if not more, to achieve. Does that point to your question, Scott?
Yeah, I think that's, I think it is important to realize that some of these things are very contextual, and you have kind of the ideal way of doing things, and then you have what's feasible given the the phone call that you got today for an interview that has to take place in an hour kind of
Right.
thing. So yeah, that's
Right.
that's very useful.
Yes, that is. I really think that can be one of the most useful and practical feedback I'm hoping to get. As yes, this is good ideally, but look at all these challenges and hurdles we would have to go through. It simply can't use it in these contexts. I would like a more concrete understanding of those limitations, because those are the hurdles that have to be overcome, I think, for challenges around emerging technologies.
Well, great. I imagine that folks do have some questions. If you want to input those into the chat, that would be excellent. We've got a couple minutes left to be able to answer some of those questions. And in the meantime, most of you have taken advantage of the opportunity to do the summary webinar evaluation. I'm sure that will be very helpful for Wes moving forward as he develops this further.
Yes, thank you. Most definitely.
And Jim says,
will the
roadmap be posted somewhere?
Go ahead, Scott. Sorry.
Yeah, once we put it through the peer review process, we'll get it up onto the NCRCRD website. Yep. That was a Jim Resick question.
So Scott, do you anticipate that being sometime within July, folks will be able to access it? Or that depends
if I
on
can get people to, if I can get people to get me the reviews back, yeah, and then of course it would depend on you to modify too, yeah.
I understand.
I guess a question I would have for the group here is maybe you could input into the chat box what you think might be ways to get this information out to a broader set of folks in the extension system.
Right.
So if you folks could maybe tap that into the chat box, that'd be helpful.
Scott, I have a brief comment back on your earlier question, an observation that I was making throughout the interviews, which is the level of sensitivity that extension educators had and interviewees, and appreciation for these complexities, and the way that they had their own particular rules of thumb for negotiating many of these hurdles. And then on the other hand, there were folks who would resort back to less of a personal sensitivity and more of a following step 1, step 2, or step 3. So I thought that was a distinction across extension educators, and that inspired me to want to be able to capture some of these particular and unique sensitivities that folks had for bringing groups together around contested issues, for instance, and be able to capture some of the broader takeaways and put them down and be able to share them. So I want to thank interviewees for explaining their cases to me.
One thought that occurs to me too is that the extension professionals may experience these issues differently depending on the length and strength of the relationship with the stakeholder groups with whom they're working.
Right.
So if you're a relative newbie and you haven't worked with a particular group at all before, you might want to tread a little more carefully than a group that has come to rely on your input and your expertise, for 20 years, and kind of know the players, and trust has been established. So, I don't know if that came through on your interviews or not, but it might be quite dangerous for a newly appointed person, new in the community, to do X, whereas a person that's been there for 20 years can do it easily. So that's another set of considerations.
I think that relates also to the roadmap, where obviously some of these things will be old hat to planning teams. This is they've done this, they've set this up. Where perhaps for others this would be something new. Maybe they're in a new territory. I think definitely the roadmap is, even though everybody's going to be looking at the same thing, it certainly is not standard for the diverse groups that can be using this. I envision this being perhaps useful to extension and planners and folks who work in city planning as well, who deal with the same similar challenges and partner with extension in those challenges. I'm not sure of the flexibility of bending it to different spaces, and that's one thing I'm hoping to get some feedback on from people, is how they can apply it, or what are some barriers to applying it in particular situations.
Well, you did get 12 volunteers that were going to look at it, so that's great. It's an excellent set of folks there. So
I think perhaps we should remind folks to please enter their email into the chat. Is that our only way of collecting participant emails? I believe it might be.
Yeah, I mean, we would be able to. I mean, you've got people telling you where they're from, so.
Oh, well, that's fine then as well. Sure, I can use the internet as well. I guess the participant list will be there, and I could cross-reference that with who was willing to be contacted.
Well, it looks like they're all helping you out here. So, yeah, we're getting a bunch of email addresses now, so that's excellent. So, yeah, I liked the suggestion. I hadn't thought about JSEP's a great suggestion from Walt Whitmer, and there was a good suggestion for the water network. Somebody also mentioned the tribal communities, and there is a Falcon conference that brings all the land grant tribal institutions together in the fall, so that might be a thought, is to make that available through that organization.
I think also go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, it's fine to talk. Go ahead.
I think also when you look at the format of the roadmap right now, it's quite raw. It's just black letters on white. If folks too had, I guess sometimes when you're in the meeting room and you're throwing things down on the table, maybe that's most useful. I think the biggest question I'm trying to ask here is, do folks envision this as being something that they would work with on their computer as a digital file, or is this something that folks would print out? That would be important too for thinking about how to convey the utility of this. I imagine with quickly moving situations, if something's not practical to use, I could imagine it'd be set to the side quite quickly.
Yep. Well, I think it's also just helpful for folks to try to, as a professional, look through what you've done and sort of internalize that, as these issues come up. So they might not run back to it and look at it the moment it's needed, but they might kind of use it as a foundational document for how they approach their work. But Marilyn says both
Right.
formats, so great.
Right.
Well, I'm not seeing a lot of more questions coming in. I think folks that were enjoyed the presentation, and we will get this archived, and we'll be sure to let folks know when the final document has been reviewed and formatted and all that stuff.
Right. Well, thank you very much then, Scott, and thank you folks for participating and hopefully for sharing your feedback on this research.
Great. Well,